Genghis Khan, the empire built on fear. Hey guys, welcome back to another long, calm descent into the quiet corners of history. Tonight, we'll be wandering across the endless grasslands of Central Asia, a place where the wind never stops blowing, the horses never stop running, and apparently neither did the wars. So, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's talk about a man whose name was basically history's way of saying, good luck sleeping after this one. Genghis Khan, the Mongol who turned half the known world into one giant smoking ruin, and somehow still managed to unite it. But don't worry, we're not here for the battles. We're here for the weird life, the slow burn of trauma, family chaos, and the sheer number of times this man probably sighed into the wind thinking, maybe conquering the world will fix my childhood. The boy who would be terror. He was born around 1162, somewhere in the cold sweep of the Mongolian steppe. Back then, the land was basically a mix of frozen grass, wild horses, and families who spent half their time raiding each other for food. His birth name was Temüjin, which roughly means blacksmith. Romantic, right? His father, Yesugei, was a tribal chief who probably thought he was doing fine until he made the mistake of stealing another man's wife. Because apparently, in 12th century Mongolia, nothing said romance like kidnapping your neighbor's bride. Temujin's mother, Holun, was that stolen bride. And honestly, she's the real MVP of this story. Because after Yesugei got himself poisoned by a rival tribe, classic move, she was left alone with 7 kids, a dead husband, and a tribe that immediately abandoned her. They literally kicked her out. Imagine being in the middle of nowhere, trying to feed your children, while your clan just shrugs and says, good luck with that. She survived on wild roots, fish, and pure spite. Temujin grew up watching that, and it's safe to say it left an impression. So when people later describe Genghis Khan as ruthless, cold, and obsessed with loyalty, well, yeah. He learned early that if you're not feared, you're forgotten. The world of steppe politics. Tribal Mongolia back then was less than a country and more of a bad group project. Every tribe wanted to lead, none of them wanted to cooperate, and everyone solved problems with arrows. Temujin's early years were one long reality show of betrayal. First, he was captured by a rival clan and enslaved. He escaped, obviously, because otherwise this story would be much shorter. Then, as a teenager, he started gathering followers, not with gold or glory, but with promises like, I won't betray you this week. That was apparently enough, because in a world where betrayal was normal, basic reliability made you a revolutionary. Love and abduction, again. Temujin eventually married Borte, his childhood sweetheart, and for a brief, suspiciously wholesome moment, things were good. They had a small camp, a few followers, and actual hope. Then, because history never lets anyone be happy, Borte got kidnapped by a rival tribe, the Merkits to be specific. And yes, this was the same tribe Temujin's dad had angered decades earlier by stealing his mother. It's like generational trauma, but with horses. Temujin went on a rescue mission, teamed up with his friend Jamuka and a local leader named Togrul. They successfully rescued Borte, but the damage was done, emotionally, politically, and possibly genetically. Soon after, Borte gave birth to a son, Jochi, whose paternity was uncertain. He raised him as his own, but whispers followed that boy his entire life. Because of course they did. Jamuka, the frenemy. Now remember Jamuka?
He and Temüjin were basically blood brothers, the medieval Mongol version of best friends forever, until they weren't. Jamuka wanted to be a noble. Temüjin wanted to be a system. Jamuka liked the old tribal order. Temüjin liked the idea that loyalty should come from merit, not family name. So naturally, they went to war. The fighting was brutal, chaotic, and probably dusty beyond imagination. At one point, Jamuka captured Temüjin's allies and boiled them alive, because apparently subtlety was not part of steppe warfare. Temüjin won in the long run, mostly because he offered his men stability, food, and the promise that maybe this time their leader wouldn't betray them at breakfast. By his early 40s, Temüjin had united most of the Mongol tribes under his rule. And that's when things got official. The birth of Genghis Khan. Around 1206, a massive gathering of tribes met at a place called the Onan River. They crowned him Genghis Khan, which translates roughly to universal ruler. No pressure. This was the moment the Mongols went from a collection of angry nomads to one of the most terrifying empires in history. But the thing is, Genghis didn't just conquer for fun. He was building a system of laws, communication, and mutual terror. He created the yasa, a kind of code of conduct that covered everything from military discipline to how many arrows you were supposed to carry. He outlawed the kidnapping of women, a solid start, and even banned the selling of women altogether. Yes, the man who began life because of a kidnapping decided maybe let's stop that. It's the kind of moral evolution only history can deliver with a straight face. Now, Genghis's approach to conquest was methodical. If you surrendered, you usually lived. If you resisted, he wiped you out so completely that even your local goat population had trust issues. Cities that surrendered early became part of his postal network, which, by the way, was faster than Europe's mail system 600 years later. Because of course it was. But the real weapon was his reputation. Genghis didn't just rely on cavalry, he weaponized fear. Rumors spread faster than his horses. People heard what happened to cities that resisted and often just opened their gates before he arrived. And Genghis? He loved efficiency. Family business. By the time he had an empire stretching from the Pacific to the Caspian, Genghis had also built something else, a wildly dysfunctional family tree. He had many wives and many children. We don't know how many exactly, but genetic studies suggest about 16 million men alive today are his descendants. That's 1 in every 200 men on Earth, which means statistically, someone watching this right now might be related to him. Congratulations, I guess. The man behind the myth. Despite the brutal image, Genghis wasn't all fire and fury. He banned torture, encouraged literacy, and promoted religious tolerance. You could worship whoever you wanted, as long as you didn't get in the way of his tax system. His leadership style was strange, half visionary, half terrifying boss. He listened to commoners, rewarded talent, and demoted nobles if they messed up. In other words, he was running a meritocracy in a world that thought bloodlines were the only resume. He built the Mongol Empire not on culture or religion, but on pure, functional loyalty, which, ironically, made it last longer than most empires built on faith. And yet, behind all that was still the lonely boy from the steppe, a kid who watched his family starve and decided that control, total, absolute control, was the only cure for fear. It worked, for him at least. And as his empire grew, so did the legend. But of course, empires don't stay calm forever. And the more he conquered, the more enemies waited for his shadow to fade. Let's drift over there next, to the endless campaigns, the bloodless bureaucracy, and the legacy of a man who somehow made terror an administrative art form. The world under his hooves.
Hey guys, welcome back. Let's sink back into the endless steppe wind for a while. The kind that hums through the grass and sounds just faintly like the hoofbeats of about 200,000 mounted warriors heading your way. When we left off, Genghis Khan had just turned a handful of quarreling nomadic tribes into one of the most terrifying armies in human history. And tonight, we'll drift through the part of his life where world domination stopped being a wild idea and started becoming an administrative challenge. Because conquering everything sounds impressive until you realize you also have to manage it. The perfect storm on horseback. Let's start with the army itself. It wasn't big because of numbers, it was big because of structure. Every Mongol soldier carried the same equipment, followed the same code, and could survive in places where most other armies would have died just from boredom and cold. They didn't rely on supply lines, they were the supply lines. Each warrior had multiple horses, up to 5, and could ride 100 miles in a day without complaint. The Mongols had no interest in luxury, no concept of comfort, and no understanding of the word vacation. They were disciplined, frighteningly fast, and, most importantly, loyal, because loyalty to Genghis wasn't optional. It was the one rule you didn't test. And because this is Genghis Khan we're talking about, he even introduced an early form of military democracy. Officers were chosen based on skill, not family. If you could shoot an arrow while galloping backward at full speed and hit a bird mid-flight, congratulations, you're promoted. It's the kind of HR system that would have made corporate life both terrifying and weirdly efficient. The Chinese problem. After uniting the Mongols, Genghis looked south, toward China, specifically the Xia and Jin dynasties, rich, ancient, walled cities filled with silk, scholars, and people who absolutely hated nomads. To the Mongols, the Chinese cities were shiny, mysterious treasure boxes guarded by bureaucrats. To Genghis, they were logistical puzzles waiting to be solved. The Jin dynasty thought they were safe behind their Great Wall. Cute. The Mongols simply went around it. Because walls, as it turned out, were not much of a defense against people who could just ride 300 miles in a week. The siege warfare part was new to them. They weren't city people after all. But Genghis wasn't one to let inexperience stop him. He hired captured Chinese and Persian engineers, learned how to build catapults, and applied steppe logic to siege tactics. If a city didn't surrender, he would surround it for months, cut off food, and play the waiting game. Mongols didn't mind waiting. They just camp outside, drink fermented mare's milk, and let time do the killing. By 1215, Genghis had captured Zhongdu, the capital of the Jin dynasty, today's Beijing. The city was burned to the ground, because apparently that was his version of saying, thanks for hosting. The Silk Road becomes the Fear Road. After China, his attention turned westward. He wasn't content with just one continent's worth of chaos. The great trade routes, the Silk Road, connected China to Central Asia and Persia. Merchants, camels, caravans, all of them moved through a web of small kingdoms and city-states that liked to collect taxes and occasionally stab messengers, which, as we'll see, was a mistake. Because one day around 1218, Genghis sent a trade caravan to the Mongolian Empire, basically modern-day Iran and Central Asia. The local governor accused them of spying and executed them. Then he shaved the beards of his ambassadors, which, culturally speaking, was like declaring war with extra steps. So Genghis did what any reasonable man with 200,000 horsemen and a grudge would do. He erased their entire empire. The Khwarezmian catastrophe. The campaign against Khwarez is one of those moments in history where you have to stop and say, okay, that escalated quickly. It began in 1219. Genghis divided his forces into multiple independent armies, each led by a trusted general or son, and sent them in from different directions. The result was chaos so organized it might as well have been divine. City after city fell. Some surrendered immediately, others resisted and ceased to exist. The Mongols flooded irrigation systems, burned crops, and left deserts where civilizations had stood for centuries. It wasn't random cruelty, it was strategy. He wanted future cities to hear about Khwarezm and think, maybe we should just open the gates. And to be fair, most of them did.
The spies, the stories, and the silence. Genghis Khan wasn't just a warrior, he was an early master of psychological warfare. He used rumor as a weapon. Before attacking a city, he'd send scouts to spread stories, exaggerating his army's size, inventing atrocities, sometimes even pretending to be survivors of fake massacres. By the time the real Mongols arrived, the enemy was already halfway to surrender. He also used silence. No boasting, no official proclamations, just quiet, followed by the sound of hooves. And that worked better than any royal decree ever could. The bureaucrat of doom. But here's where things get surprisingly bureaucratic. For a man whose career highlight reel was mostly conquest and chaos, Genghis was obsessed with organization. He introduced a system of written records in multiple languages. He built a postal relay network that could send messages across Asia faster than medieval Europe could send one across France. He even issued passports, called paisa, for his merchants and officials, guaranteeing them safe passage across his realm. If you think about it, that's basically the Mongol version of Amazon Prime. Fast, ruthless, and available everywhere. Family issues again. Meanwhile, back at camp, things were less efficient. His sons, Jochi, Chagatai, Ogedei, and Toyu, were constantly arguing. Especially Jochi, the maybe not biological son. The others never stopped reminding him that his mother had been kidnapped, and Genghis himself never fully denied the rumors. It was the kind of unresolved family drama that could power 10 seasons of a reality show titled Keeping Up with the Khans. Despite the tension, Genghis had a weirdly professional approach to succession. He planned everything. His empire was divided into territories, his generals had clear orders, and his sons, well, they mostly got what they wanted, except peace of mind. Before the silence, Persia fell. By 1221, the Khwarezmian Empire was gone. Its Shah had fled into the Caspian Sea and died on an island, hunted to the end by Mongol cavalry. Genghis didn't even need to kill him personally. The stress did that for him. In a way, it was poetic. A man who had ruled one of the richest regions on Earth, undone by the single worst customer service incident in history. Afterwards, the Mongols went further west into Persia, Georgia, even parts of Russia. They mapped rivers, counted herds, and built administrative centers. And all of it was recorded, systemized, and taxed. Because underneath the dust and death, Genghis was building something lasting. An empire not just of land, but of order. Terrifying, yes, but orderly. The legend becomes policy. By the mid-1220s, Genghis was in his 60s. He had unified tribes, crushed empires, and reshaped Asia. But he wasn't just thinking about war anymore. He was thinking about legacy. He convened councils, refined his laws, and set plans for future generations. He wanted the Mongol world to last, not just as a conquest, but as a structure. Trade routes, taxation systems, communication networks, all meticulously organized. He even created an early form of religious freedom, inviting Buddhist, Muslim, Christian, and Taoist leaders to debate in his court. His reasoning was simple. If they're busy arguing about heaven, they won't argue with me. The end on the horizon. Of course, the man who had spent his life outrunning everyone eventually couldn't outrun time. But we'll get to that soon. For now, let's rest in the quiet aftermath of his greatest campaigns. The burned cities cooling under the night sky, the couriers galloping under starlight, and the empire stretching wider than any before. And somewhere in his tent, Genghis Khan himself, wrapped in furs, silent, staring into the fire.
probably wondering whether all that control finally silenced the fear that had followed him since childhood. It didn't. But that's a story for another night.
The Final Ride. Genghis Khan's last campaign and the empire after him. Hey guys, welcome back to another late-night drift through dusty chronicles and quiet chaos. Tonight, we're following Genghis Khan on his last campaign, the slow, inevitable closing act of a man who spent most of his life trying to outrun both death and disappointment. So, take a deep breath, let the world fade, and picture an old warrior wrapped in furs, still staring at maps he hasn't finished yet. Because even near the end, Genghis Khan wasn't planning to retire. He was planning to conquer one more time. Old Age, Mongol Edition. By the 1220s, Genghis was somewhere between 60 and 65 years old, which in medieval steppe years was basically ancient. He'd outlived almost everyone who'd ever betrayed him, killed him, or doubted him. But the idea of rest, that wasn't part of his vocabulary. The man's retirement plan was to keep invading until something finally stopped him. And the next name on his list was the Western Shah Kingdom. Yes again, because apparently one thorough destruction wasn't enough. You might remember them. They were one of the first Chinese dynasties he'd tangled with decades earlier. He had demanded tribute, they'd complied, and then, during his later wars, they'd backed out. In Mongol logic, that was the equivalent of ghosting your warlord. So, naturally, he decided to circle back and handle it personally. The final campaign. In 1226, he set out once more across the Gobi Desert. His army was massive, disciplined, and still terrifying. They moved like a storm, endless waves of horsemen, dust trailing behind them, each soldier calm, efficient, and probably very tired of fermented milk. By this point, Genghis didn't need to shout commands. His generals were veterans. They knew exactly what to do, which was mostly ride, encircle, repeat. The Shah cities began to fall one after another. Temples were burned, fortresses collapsed. It was less of a war, more of a grim routine. But there was something different this time. For once, the campaign wasn't going perfectly. The old Khan's health was fading. He suffered from fatigue, probably injuries, and possibly old battle wounds that never healed. He'd been thrown from his horse multiple times in his life. Not surprising when your entire career involved galloping into chaos. And though no one dared to say it, everyone knew the wind that had driven this empire was finally starting to slow down. The fall from the saddle. Now, this is where history goes quiet, because no one's exactly sure how he died. One version says he fell off his horse during a hunt and never recovered. Another claims he died from illness. And then there's the darker version, that he was injured in battle, possibly by the Tangut people of Shah, and kept it secret to maintain morale. Whatever happened, sometime in 1227, Genghis Khan, the man who had terrified the world, finally stopped breathing. His death was kept a secret for months. His army continued its campaign as if nothing had happened. Orders were still issued in his name. The Mongols conquered the last Shah stronghold, and only then did they allow themselves to grieve. It was quiet, private, and efficient, exactly how he'd run everything else. The empire without him. After his death, leadership passed to his third son, Ogedei Khan, because even Genghis knew his other sons were complicated. Jochi had died before him, possibly from illness, possibly from stress, definitely from family drama.
Chagatai was too stubborn. Tolui, his youngest, was strong but wild. Ogedei, on the other hand, was calm, deliberate, and willing to listen to advice, which made him the least dramatic option and therefore the best one. Under Ogedei, the Mongol Empire didn't just survive, it exploded. The armies continued westward, sweeping across Russia, Persia, and into Europe. Entire cities vanished under their hooves. From Hungary to Baghdad, no one was safe from a cavalry charge that began with one man on the steppes decades earlier. The ghost in the empire. But here's the quiet truth. Even after his death, Genghis Khan's presence never left. His name became a kind of spell, invoked before battle, etched onto banners, whispered in foreign courts as both a warning and a curse. He wasn't just a person anymore. He was policy. His code, the Yasa, became the guiding principle of Mongol rule. It covered everything: taxes, military discipline, family conduct, even table manners. The laws were strict, but they worked. Merchants thrived, roads were safe, and messages could travel from Beijing to the Black Sea without being robbed once. Because who in their right mind would rob a courier carrying a letter stamped with the seal of Genghis Khan? The human side, if you can call it that. For all his power, Genghis was still a man defined by contradiction. He valued loyalty, but trusted almost no one. He sought peace, but only through total destruction. He unified the world by tearing half of it apart. There are stories of him showing mercy, freeing captives, or rewarding faithful allies. There are also stories of him wiping entire civilizations off the map. And somehow, both versions feel equally true. The Mongols believed he was chosen by heaven, Tengri, the eternal blue sky. To them, his conquests weren't cruelty, they were destiny. To everyone else, they were nightmares that galloped out of nowhere and left silence behind. The legacy of a fearful genius. Centuries later, historians still argue about what he really was: a barbarian, a visionary, a traumatized stepchild who built an empire because it was the only way he knew to feel safe? The answer is probably yes to all three, because his empire didn't just reshape geography, it rewired how people thought about power. He showed the world that strength didn't come from castles or titles, but from mobility, discipline, and absolute certainty. He created global trade before globalization, communication before telegraphs, and administration before bureaucrats had fancy pens. And all of it began with one family starving by a frozen river, deciding never to be helpless again. The sleep of empires. Eventually, like all empires, the Mongols faded. By the 14th century, their descendants were arguing, their territories breaking apart, and their once feared name slowly becoming a bedtime story. But Genghis Khan never really disappeared. His bloodline still threads through millions of people. His legend still gallops through the pages of history. And his empire, even in ruins, left the world connected in ways it had never been before. The Silk Road became safer. Trade flourished. Cultures mingled. It was as if his shadow stretched across centuries, a strange gift from a man who ruled by fear, but accidentally built a bridge. So tonight, as the wind hums across the plains of Mongolia, maybe it still carries a whisper of hooves, of empire, of a man who rose from nothing and conquered everything, just to silence the echo of his own hunger. And somewhere out there, under the cold earth, that whisper sleeps. Not at peace, just quiet. Because even history gets tired eventually. The Sons of the Sky. How Genghis Khan's descendants took over the world and each other. Hey guys, welcome back. You can probably still hear the wind from last time, the kind that rattles yurts and carries old names through the dark. Tonight, that wind is full of arguments. Because Genghis Khan may have conquered the world, but he also left behind several sons who had very different ideas of what to do with it. So, get comfortable. Let's settle in among the campfires of succession drama, Mongol style. It's going to be quiet, political, and mildly depressing. The problem with legacy. Genghis Khan's empire was big, like wrap around the globe big. But it wasn't built to last forever, at least not without him. When he died, he left behind a will that divided everything among his 4 main sons. It was neat on paper. It was a disaster in practice. Because giving land to family sounds noble, until you remember that everyone in this family carried weapons, armies, and egos the size of continents. Still, he tried to be organized. He appointed Ogedei, his 3rd son, as Great Khan, the supreme ruler of the entire empire. The others were supposed to obey him. You can imagine how well that went. Ogedei, the bureaucrat who inherited a storm. Let's start with Ogedei. If Genghis was the storm, Ogedei was the calm that followed. He wasn't particularly ruthless. He wasn't particularly brilliant. He was, in the nicest possible way, aggressively average. And that's exactly what the empire needed. Where Genghis ruled through fear, Ogedei ruled through delegation. He surrounded himself with administrators, translators, and advisors, many of them from conquered peoples. Persians, Uyghurs, Chinese bureaucrats, all quietly running the machinery of empire, while Ogedei nodded approvingly and drank a little too much fermented mare's milk. He formalized the empire's capital at Karakoram, a city built out of steppe dust and ambition. It wasn't glamorous, mostly tents, mud, and a few wooden halls, but it was the Mongol idea of permanence. Under Ogedei, the empire expanded even more. Mongol armies marched into Eastern Europe, Russia, and Persia. Cities fell like dominoes, and Europe started having very anxious dreams about horsemen appearing on the horizon. By 1241, the Mongols reached Hungary and Poland. They were unstoppable, until Ogedei died, and that's when everything froze. Because Mongol generals, no matter how far they were from home, had to stop fighting and return for the next election. Yes, the empire that crushed kingdoms also insisted on holding family meetings. The Kurultai, history's most awkward family reunion. The Kurultai was the great Mongol council, a gathering of princes, generals, and whoever had survived long enough to still matter. They met to choose the next great Khan, and it was always a circus of egos, rival wives, and distant cousins pretending to be loyal. After Ogedei died, his widow Toregen Hatun took over as regent, one of the first women in world history to rule the largest empire on earth. She wasn't shy about it either. She replaced Ogedei's advisors with her own people and spent 5 years setting up her son, Guyuk, to inherit. And, to be fair, she did it efficiently, just with a side of paranoia and quiet assassinations. When Guyuk finally became Great Khan, everyone expected him to lead like his grandfather. Instead, he mostly scolded people. He was arrogant, impatient, and seemed to believe that yelling was a leadership style. He didn't last long. He died suddenly in 1248 while marching west, possibly from illness, possibly from poison, possibly from the accumulated stress of trying to manage his relatives. No one knows for sure, but everyone exhaled a little when he was gone.
The empire splits like ice. After Guyuk's death, the empire began to fracture, not violently at first, just structurally. Each son of Genghis Khan had his own territory. Jochi's line ruled the west, what became the Golden Horde in Russia. Chagatai's line ruled Central Asia. Ogadai's descendants controlled Mongolia and parts of China. Tului's family oversaw the east, including Genghis's heartlands and eventually China proper. On a map, it looked unified. In reality, it was a family group chat full of people typing in all caps. They were supposed to obey one great Khan, but distance, pride, and different languages slowly turned the empire into 4 separate realms, each pretending to get along. Mongke, the last great Khan. Eventually, one of Tului's sons, Mongke Khan, managed to restore order. He was thoughtful, methodical, and terrifyingly efficient. Think of him as the corporate reformer of the Mongol world. He restructured taxes, expanded the postal network, and launched new conquests. He sent his brothers Hulegu west toward Persia and Kublai east into China. Mongke wasn't flashy, but under his watch, the Mongol world became a single humming system again, from Korea to Kiev. Then, in 1259, he died unexpectedly during a campaign in China. And just like that, everything fell apart again. It was almost poetic, the empire always strongest under one man, and always collapsing the moment that man stopped breathing. Kublai and the Empire of Two Worlds. Mongke's death triggered another round of succession chaos. 2 brothers, Kublai and Arakboke, both claimed the throne. Kublai was pragmatic, worldly, and already halfway to being Chinese. Arakboke was traditional, loyal to the old steppe ways, and very much not into the idea of cinified palaces. The brothers went to war, civil war, splitting the empire down the middle. In the end, Kublai won. He declared himself Great Khan in 1260 and shifted the imperial capital to Beijing. That alone tells you everything. The Mongol Empire was now half nomad, half civilization. Kublai embraced Chinese culture, founded the Yuan dynasty, and ruled as emperor. He built palaces, printed money, and wore silk. He even tried to invade Japan twice and failed both times thanks to typhoons, later called the divine wind or kamikaze. It was almost as if the heavens were politely reminding him that the sea doesn't care about empires. Hulegu and the burning of Baghdad. Meanwhile, out west, Hulegu had built his own legacy, one drenched in both architectural ambition and blood. In 1258, he captured Baghdad, the jewel of the Islamic world. The city had been a center of knowledge, art, and science for centuries. He destroyed it in a week. The caliph was rolled into a carpet and trampled to death, supposedly so no royal blood touched the ground. The libraries burned for days. Books turned to ash, and the Tigris River ran black with pink. It was the kind of moment that historians still whisper about, the symbolic death of the medieval Islamic Golden Age. Hulegu then founded the Ilkhanate in Persia, another branch of the family business. He built cities, encouraged trade, and, like the others, quietly ignored whoever was calling himself Great Khan that year. The Golden Horde. Genghis goes Russian. Up in the northwest, the descendants of Jochi ruled the Golden Horde. Their territory stretched across the frozen plains of Russia and Eastern Europe, cold, endless, and filled with subjects who really didn't want to pay tribute. But they did, because the horde was organized to the T. They collected taxes, ran postal routes, and even issued coinage. They converted to Islam, built capitals like Sarai, and occasionally rode west to remind Europe that yes, the Mongols still existed. For centuries, Russian princes paid tribute to them, quietly waiting for the day when they could stop. That day wouldn't come until the 15th century. So for about 200 years, Europe lived under the shadow of Genghis Khan's great-grandchildren, people who had never met him, but still lived by his system of order through fear. The empire that forgot it was won.
By the 1300s, the Mongol world was a patchwork quilt of dynasties. Yuan in China, Ilkhanate in Persia, Chagatai in Central Asia, Golden Horde in the north. Each had its own rulers, languages, religions, and ambitions. They traded, fought, allied, betrayed, often in the same decade. The idea of one great Mongol empire had become more of a bedtime story. And yet, for a while, it still worked. Trade flourished. The Silk Road was the safest it had ever been. Travelers like Marco Polo journeyed across Asia and lived to write about it, something that would have been unthinkable a century earlier. For a brief, improbable moment, the world was connected by a common fear, and that fear kept the peace. But time, as always, wins. By the late 1300s, the Yuan dynasty in China collapsed under rebellion. Persia fell to new powers. The Golden Horde splintered, and Central Asia descended into chaos again, as if the wind of the steppes had finally exhaled. The descendants of Genghis Khan faded into history, some as kings, some as footnotes, some as legends. And somewhere along the way, his story stopped being about conquest and started being about memory. Because empires end, but names linger. So tonight, if you ever wonder what power really looks like, it's not the sword or the crown or the palace. It's the echo that refuses to die, even after the empire does. And few echoes have ever carried farther than the one that began with a hungry child by the Onan River. Echoes of Empire, how Genghis Khan still shapes the modern world. Hey guys, welcome back. You've followed me across the steppes, through dust storms, dynasties, and broken thrones. But tonight, we slow down. Because history doesn't really end, it fades. And sometimes, what remains isn't ruins, but ripples. Ripples of blood, belief, and memory, stretching all the way from medieval tents to modern passports. This is the afterlife of Genghis Khan. The Forgotten Return. When the Mongol Empire finally collapsed, it didn't fall like a tree. It dissolved like mist. No great last battle, no clear finale, just exhaustion, distance, and the quiet unraveling. But the world it left behind was changed forever. Empires that rose after, the Ming in China, the Ottomans in Turkey, the Mughals in India, even Muscovy in Russia, all inherited some small piece of the Mongol system. They took the roads, the couriers, the postal relays, the trade routes, the diplomacy, the census, the entire invisible machinery of empire, and they kept it running long after the Mongols themselves were gone. It's strange, really. The conquerors, who were once called barbarians, ended up teaching civilization how to organize itself. The Empire of Roads. Let's start with the most overlooked Mongol invention, the Yam system. Think of it as the world's first reliable express network, a relay system of stations every 25 to 30 miles, stocked with fresh horses, supplies, and guards. Messengers carrying the Great Khan's orders could travel from Mongolia to Persia in just a few weeks, faster than mail could move in Europe until the 1800s. Today, every postal service, courier network, and even international logistics chain traces a little of its DNA back to that idea, that a message is only as powerful as the road beneath it. And the Mongols built the road. The Silk Road rewired. Before Genghis Khan, the Silk Road was dangerous. Bandits, border tolls, shifting kingdoms, a merchant could lose his fortune or his life before reaching the next oasis. Under Mongol rule, it became safe. safer, in fact, than it had ever been. A single empire spanned Asia, uniting lands that had never shared peace before. Persian glass met Chinese silk. Venetian traders met Arab mathematicians in the markets of Samarkand. And ideas, not just goods, began to travel. Paper money, gunpowder, printing, the compass, all of it crossed westward along routes once guarded by Mongol patrols. Even the Black Death, yes, that too, traveled through Mongol trade networks, riding the same caravans that carried prosperity. A grim reminder that globalization always carries both creation and contagion.
The Paper Empire. You probably don't think of Genghis Khan when you swipe a credit card or handle a banknote, but maybe you should, because one of the earliest systems of paper currency was institutionalized under the Yuan dynasty, the Mongol dynasty founded by Kublai Khan in China. Printed with seals, backed by imperial decree, and accepted across thousands of miles, it worked, mostly. It was money by trust, a revolutionary idea in the 1200s. Marco Polo described it in awe, and centuries later, the idea would inspire Europe's own experiments with paper credit. So, in a sense, the great Khan's descendants helped create not just an empire of land, but the first empire of symbolic value. The kind of empire that now lives in wallets, not maps. The Mongol Code. Long before modern nations wrote constitutions, Genghis Khan had his own, the Yasa. It wasn't a single book, but a set of laws, customs, and commands memorized and enforced by his generals. It banned theft, punished betrayal, and rewarded merit over bloodline. It required religious tolerance and protected diplomats. It sounds almost modern, doesn't it? The Yasa wasn't about ideology, it was about stability. In a world where tribes fought endlessly, Genghis imposed a single, cold, efficient rule. You can live freely as long as you obey absolutely. The echoes of that mindset, order before opinion, unity before freedom, can still be felt in how many modern states think about power. The shadow of fear. For centuries, Europe remembered Genghis Khan not as a man, but as a nightmare. The Mongols were the horsemen of revelation, the scourge of God. Their arrival marked the end of worlds, the burning of cities, the collapse of old certainties. But over time, the fear softened into fascination. Scholars began to study the empire, not as a horror, but as a miracle of coordination. A decentralized world brought briefly into order by one will. Even today, historians still argue about what he was, a visionary or a villain, a unifier or a destroyer, a genius or just a lucky survivor of chaos. The truth, as always, is both. And then there's the rumor, the statistic that sounds like myth, that 1 in every 200 men alive today carries the Y chromosome of Genghis Khan. It's not superstition, it's science. Geneticists traced a unique marker spreading across Asia and parts of Europe, one that originated around the time and region of Genghis's reign. Of course, the exact number is debated, but even the conservative estimates suggest millions share his genetic fingerprint. An empire may fall, but DNA doesn't. It's as if history found a way to keep whispering through blood. Mongolia today. Mongolia is a quiet echo of its old grandeur, a vast open land where horses still outnumber people. The capital, Ulaanbaatar, hums with modern life, but beyond it lie the steppes, endless, empty, and strangely eternal. There, Genghis Khan is not a villain,
He's a national ancestor, a symbol of resilience and identity. His face is on the currency, his name on airports, vodka bottles, and statues. Yet there's a calm pride in it, not of conquest, but of endurance. Because for a small nation caught between Russia and China, remembering Genghis isn't about war. It's about proof that once this windswept land ruled the world. The lessons left behind. If there's one quiet truth in all of this, it's that history doesn't care about good or bad, only about what works. And for a time, the Mongol way worked. They built without bricks, governed without writing, connected the world before it even knew it was one. Their strength wasn't just in swords or speed, it was in adaptability. They borrowed from Persians, adopted from Chinese, traded with Europeans. They were global before the word existed. In their wake, the modern world took form. Empires learned to move faster, govern wider, and think bigger. So maybe, somewhere between terror and brilliance, Genghis Khan taught humanity something essential, that unity, no matter how brief or brutal, can reshape everything. And that's how the story ends. Not with a war drum, not with an empire's roar, but with a whisper that never fades, the sound of hooves that once shook the world. Every border drawn, every empire dreamed, every ambition whispered in the dark, still rides faintly in that echo. So tonight, if you ever stand under a vast empty sky and you feel a cold wind move, steady and ancient, listen closely. That's not the wind, that's memory, and it still remembers his name.
The Mongol Renaissance, how the world got smarter after the storm. Hey guys, welcome back to another late-night drift through forgotten ages and tired empires. Tonight, we're doing something a little different. Because after Genghis Khan's death, the world didn't just rebuild. It reconnected. It learned. And in one of history's strangest ironies, an empire forged in war ended up sparking a kind of global enlightenment. Quiet, accidental, but world-changing all the same. So dim the lights. Let the world outside fade. And let's follow the trail of knowledge that galloped out of Mongolia. The dust settles. When the Mongols first swept across Asia, the world flinched. Cities burned, libraries vanished. But then, after the shock, something unexpected happened. Trade resumed. Scholars traveled again. And the roots of conquest became the roads of communication. It's like history took a breath, then decided to make the most of all that open land. Under the Mongol Peace, or Pax Mongolica, the entire stretch from China to the Mediterranean became one enormous, cautiously stable network. For the first time in history, you could travel across continents without changing languages every 100 miles or getting robbed every 100 feet. It was bureaucracy, but with horses, and it worked. Letters from Persia reached Beijing. Chinese engineers reached Baghdad. Persian doctors arrived in India. For about a century, the world was connected by hoofbeats. Marco Polo's sleepy adventure. This is where our favorite Venetian storyteller enters, Marco Polo. He left Venice in 1271 and reached the court of Kublai Khan, Genghis's grandson, years later. He stayed for 2 decades, watching, trading, and probably exaggerating. When he finally got back home, no one believed him. His book, The Travels of Marco Polo, was basically medieval clickbait. titled something like, "I saw things you wouldn't believe," and also giant birds. But buried in the tall tales was something real. The sense of a connected, intelligent world that Europeans had never imagined before. A world where paper money worked, roads were safe, and science was actually respected. For sleepy old Europe, it was like someone had opened a window. The scholars' caravan. While Polo told stories, others brought knowledge. Persian astronomers found work in Chinese observatories. Chinese engineers taught siegecraft to Middle Eastern rulers. Arab mathematicians shared their algebra with Mongol administrators who needed to count taxes across half the world. Even medicine traveled. Herbs from Tibet, surgical tools from Baghdad, hygiene techniques from China. The Mongols, to their credit, didn't suppress knowledge. They didn't care who invented it, only whether it worked. That's the quiet genius of their empire. They weren't dreamers, they were adapters. If something made life more efficient, they absorbed it immediately. Kublai Khan's Court of Curiosities. Kublai Khan, Genghis's grandson, was, let's say, ambitiously cultured. He loved Chinese art, Persian architecture, and Buddhist philosophy, all at once. In his court, you could find Confucian scholars debating with Muslim astronomers while Mongol generals argued about horse tack nearby. It was chaos, but productive chaos. He commissioned massive maps of the known world, some of the most accurate of their time. He expanded canals, improved grain transport, and built the city of Dadu, later known as Beijing. In a way, he took his grandfather's empire and turned it into a kind of laboratory for civilization. The secret libraries. And yes, the Mongols did destroy libraries early on, but they also built new ones. Under the Ilkhanate in Persia, rulers like Hulagu Khan and his descendants supported scholars and translators. They rebuilt Baghdad's intellectual scene after its tragic sack. They founded observatories, sponsored Persian histories, and hired mathematicians to calculate lunar calendars. In other words, they broke the world, then hired people to figure out how to fix it. It's a pattern that feels weirdly familiar. The unexpected bridge to the Renaissance. Europe, meanwhile, was eavesdropping. Mongol envoys reached Italy and France. Letters were exchanged. Trade flowed again through the Black Sea. And through those channels came something subtle but crucial. Paper, gunpowder, compasses, and printing. All of them traveling west through Mongol hands. By the 1400s, those inventions would light the fuse of the European Renaissance. Painters, sailors, and mathematicians all benefited without realizing who to thank. The Mongols didn't invent these ideas, but they made them travel. It's ironic, the empire that terrified Europe ended up giving it the tools to conquer the world later. The art of control. Mongol administration also influenced how later states governed. They introduced census taking, tax codes, spy networks, and efficient regional governors. They standardized weights and measures, promoted trade rights, and used multilingual scribes. They were, in many ways, the world's first global managers. If you've ever filled out a government form, somewhere deep down, you're participating in a bureaucratic idea that once came from the steppe. The faithful patchwork. Another strange feature of Mongol rule was its religious tolerance. The great Khan himself practiced a kind of spiritual pragmatism. He believed in the eternal blue sky, Tengri, but he let everyone else do their thing. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and shamans all shared his empire, sometimes literally serving in the same army. There are records of Christian monks debating with Buddhist priests in Karakoram, the old Mongol capital, probably over tea, possibly over which god rode the better horse. The result? Centuries of relative coexistence across Asia. And in a very sleepy way, it showed the world that tolerance wasn't idealism. It was just good management. The echo in modern science. Even today, historians trace parts of modern data science, mapping, and logistics back to Mongol methods. They mapped stars to navigate armies. They used census data to allocate troops. They analyzed terrain like early field statisticians. It wasn't romantic, but it was systematic. And in a sense, that's what modernity really is, the art of organized knowledge, the sleep of civilization. So here's the paradox. Genghis Khan conquered through fear, but the world that came after him, his grandson's world, was held together by curiosity, not by blood, but by information. It's as if the wind of war cleared a space and knowledge quietly moved in. When we think of the Renaissance, we picture Florence and Venice, but the roads that fed it began somewhere else, under the shadow of Mongol banners. The dream of connection. Maybe that's the legacy worth remembering. Not the burning cities or the lost kingdoms, but the rare, brief moment when the world was one enormous conversation, carried on horseback, whispered in trade routes, written in forgotten alphabets. A world where fear accidentally gave birth to connection. So tonight, as you drift off, imagine those old caravans moving through the moonlight, camels swaying, hooves on sand, merchants trading words instead of weapons. The empire is gone, but the roots remain. And somewhere between the silence of the steppes and the hum of modern cities, you can still hear the faint rhythm of history breathing.
When the world stopped galloping, the quiet fall of the Mongol dynasties. Hey guys, welcome back to another soft descent into the past. Tonight, the wind has changed. The riders are fewer, the maps more complicated, and the silence after conquest is starting to feel permanent. This is how the Mongol Empire stopped moving after the storm. By the mid-1300s, the world the Great Khan had welded together was fraying at the edges. It hadn't been defeated, no heroic last stand, no decisive collapse. It was just tired. Empires, it turns out, die the same way people do, slowly, inconsistently, and a little confused about what went wrong. Too many thrones, not enough Khans. Remember that famous saying about too many cooks? Now imagine them all armed, crowned, and related. After Genghis, his sons divided the empire into khanates. The Yuan dynasty in China, ruled by Kublai, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in the Russian steppes. Each branch promised loyalty to the Great Khan in theory and ignored him in practice. Distance turned coordination into myth. Riders carrying royal orders took months to cross deserts, by which time the orders were obsolete and someone new was in charge. It was the world's biggest family group chat, muted by everyone. The Yuan dynasty slows down. Kublai Khan's China looked impressive on paper. Grand palaces, canals, paper money, imported falcons, the works. But underneath, it was creaking. Chinese bureaucrats hated foreign rule. Taxes climbed, inflation ballooned, famines followed. By 1368, rebel armies under the future Hung Wu emperor, founder of the Ming dynasty, marched on Beijing. Kublai's descendants retreated north, and the Yuan dynasty simply faded out. No final battle hymn, just an emperor riding away into mist. The Ilkhanate's last banquet. Over in Persia, the Ilkhanate prospered briefly. They built observatories, minted coins, and experimented with a sort of proto-Renaissance before anyone in Italy was painting angels. But succession squabbles ended the show. When a ruler died without an heir in 1335, local generals and governors politely tore the country apart. Persia splintered into small dynasties, each claiming to be the rightful continuation of Genghis's dream. It was less collapse and more
messy divorce. The Chagatai problem. Central Asia, home turf of Genghis's tribe, fared no better. The Chagatai Khanate split into east and west halves, both claiming divine legitimacy and neither paying their taxes. Nomads kept raiding, merchants kept trading, and the region stayed halfway between chaos and commerce. It's honestly impressive how long it managed to exist in that particular balance of dysfunction. Out of its ashes would rise Temüjin, the 14th century conqueror who wanted to recreate the Mongol glory days, only with more marble and less subtlety.
The Golden Horde's long winter. And then there was the Golden Horde. Centered on the Volga River, it ruled over vast stretches of what is now Russia, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. For 2 centuries, it dominated Slavic princes, especially the one from a small, cold town called Moscow. But over time, that small town grew rich collecting taxes for its Mongol overlords. Eventually, it realized it didn't need overlords. By the late 1400s, Ivan III of Moscow stopped sending tribute. The horde tried to reassert power, lost, and scattered into smaller khanates. The descendants of Genghis Khan were still technically royalty, but their power had shrunk to the size of local markets and family feuds. The quiet causes. So why did the greatest land empire in history dissolve? Not rebellion, not invasion, just entropy. Communication failed. Succession rules were unclear. Economies built on conquest couldn't adapt to peace. The empire's infrastructure, brilliant when powered by fear, rusted when calm returned. Even the horses got fewer. Fewer herds meant fewer warriors, fewer couriers, fewer connections. The pulse slowed. The plague arrives. Then came the Black Death, the most morbid international traveler of them all. Carried by fleas, rats, and trade caravans, it swept along the same safe roads the Mongols had built. Between 1346 and 1353, millions died from China to Europe. Cities emptied, trade collapsed. Even the myth of Mongol invincibility couldn't outride disease. When fear of contagion replaced fear of cavalry, the empire's magic disappeared. The forgotten women of the Mongol Empire, mothers, regents, and the real power behind the Khan. Hey again, friends. Settle back into that warm, steady breathing. Maybe pour some tea if you're still awake. Tonight, we're going to talk about the half of the empire that history mostly forgot to write about. The women who actually ran it. Because while the men were off galloping across continents, someone had to run the camp, manage alliances, and make sure the next generation didn't freeze, starve, or declare war on each other before breakfast. The steppe was never just a man's world. It's tempting to picture the Mongols as a purely masculine force, endless riders, storms of arrows, and Khans shouting orders at the horizon. But steppe society was surprisingly balanced. Nomadic life required partnership. Men handled warfare and herding. Women managed tents, trade, diplomacy, and inheritance. And because Genghis Khan spent most of his career on the move, women often ran the empire he supposedly ruled. So yes, the greatest conqueror in history had an empire that, behind the scenes, ran on matriarchal horsepower. Berthay, the one who waited and never forgot. Let's start with Berthay, the first and main wife of Genghis Khan. She was the calm center of his storm. They married young, were separated when rival tribes kidnapped her, and reunited after he rescued her, a story that reads like an epic but probably just felt exhausting at the time. That event hardened Genghis's sense of vengeance and loyalty, but it also showed him that Berthay wasn't just a wife, she was the anchor of his legitimacy. Her sons were recognized as his heirs, which mattered in a world obsessed with bloodlines and succession.
While Genghis rode to war, Berke governed the homeland, managing logistics, food supplies, and communication. Think of her as the empire's first project manager. No glory, no titles, just relentless competence. The silent regents. After Genghis's death, a strange pattern emerged. Each generation of male khans brought chaos. Each generation of women quietly fixed it. Turegene Khatun, the widow of Ogedei Khan, ruled as regent for 5 years. She didn't just hold power, she kept it, negotiated treaties, reorganized taxation, and even replaced hostile officials. When foreign emissaries arrived, they were shocked to find themselves dealing with a queen in full authority. One Persian chronicler called her the most powerful woman in the world, which, given the century, was saying something. Her successor, Sorgatani Beki, took things even further. She was the daughter-in-law of Genghis Khan and mother of 4 future rulers, including Kublai Khan. Fluent in multiple languages, shrewd in politics, she turned her sons into empire builders. She was so respected that even Christian chroniclers in Europe admired her, calling her a woman of virtue and great wisdom. Basically, she was the empire's secret continuity plan.
The politics of marriage. Marriage among Mongols wasn't romantic, it was logistical. Every union meant territory, trade access, or a temporary peace treaty. Genghis himself used his daughters as ambassadors. He married them to local rulers on the condition that they govern their new lands jointly, or, in many cases, that they govern outright. These women often outlived their husbands and ran regions with military command. Some even commanded troops in person. In a strange, pragmatic way, Mongol diplomacy was built on sisterhood, just one that came with horses and composite bows. Kutulun, the wrestler princess. And then there was Kutulun, the warrior princess who could probably bench press half her cousins. She was the great-great-granddaughter of Genghis Khan and lived in the late 13th century. Kutulun refused to marry any man unless he could defeat her in wrestling. Spoiler, no one ever did. She allegedly won hundreds of horses from would-be suitors who underestimated her. Even Marco Polo wrote about her, amazed and slightly bewildered that a Mongol woman could outfight most men in her tribe. She rode into battle beside her father, capturing enemies with her bare hands, which is honestly not bad for someone history still insists on calling a princess. Life inside the gur. Let's slow down and step inside a gur, or yurt, the round felt tent that defined Mongol life. Inside, everything was in its place. The hearth burned constantly, tended mostly by women. Food was simple: milk, cheese, meat, and endless fermented mare's milk, which probably made everyone just tipsy enough to tolerate the wind. While men trained for war, women organized caravans, ran trade with China and Persia, and maintained the legal structure of the clans. If a man died in battle, his widow inherited his household and livestock. Independence that shocked foreign observers used to European patriarchy. In the Mongol world, a woman could own, command, and decide. Not as an exception, as a rule. Sorgaktani's legacy. Let's float back to Sorgaktani Beki for a moment, because she deserves a second look. After her husband's death, she maneuvered her sons into power by sheer patience and timing. While her rivals waged open wars, she cultivated alliances quietly, feeding diplomats, supporting trade, and keeping neutrality until the right moment. When her son Monke became Great Khan, it wasn't by chance. It was the result of 2 decades of her quiet control. Later historians would call her the shadow behind the throne. But really, she was the throne, just one no one dared to admit. Forgotten on purpose. When later chroniclers rulers, mostly men, wrote the official Mongol histories, they minimized the role of these women. Some were turned into footnotes, others were erased completely. But you can still trace their influence in letters, administrative decrees, and foreign correspondence. Even the architecture of power changed. Mongol palaces had quarters specifically for the queen's staff, which operated almost as a parallel government. Imagine a world where two empires shared the same palace, one official, one invisible. And guess which one kept the taxes running on time? The afterglow of their power. When the empire fragmented, it was often the women who preserved its memory. Descendants of Mongol queens married into other royal lines, Turkic, Persian, and even Indian. Through them, Mongol blood and culture spread into new dynasties, especially the Mughal Empire in India, which claimed descent from both Genghis Khan and Temüjin. So, in a poetic sense, the Mongol women outlived the empire by centuries. They survived in genes, traditions, and even languages. They were the quiet carriers of a legacy, built on movement, but sustained by memory. A calm ending. So, as the hooves faded and the empire turned to legend, it wasn't the men who remembered, it was the women who kept the stories alive, whispering them to children in tents under endless stars. The conquerors are gone, but the women who endured, they were the real architects of empire. They didn't build with cities or swords, but with patience. And patience, as history proves, outlasts everything. Fade out. If you close your eyes now, imagine the steppe again. The wind brushing against felt tents. Inside, a fire flickers low. Someone stirs milk in a pot, while an old song hums quietly about warriors who never came back, and the women who kept the world turning until they did. Because that's the secret history of the Mongols. While men conquered the world, women made sure there was still one to come home to.
Kublai Khan, the emperor who tried to become Chinese. Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we drift into the life of Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai, a man who inherited an empire so vast it could easily give you a headache or a mild existential crisis. Unlike his grandfather, Kublai's battles weren't just against armies on horseback. His wars were against culture, geography, climate, and most daunting of all, himself. The Grand Inheritance. Kublai was born in 1215, already marked by destiny and horses. He grew up watching uncles, cousins, and fathers-in-law carve the world apart, which must have been stressful. By the time Genghis died, Kublai had to carve out his own khanate, the Yuan dynasty, which would stretch across China. The twist? He wasn't Chinese, not even close. He was Mongol to the bone, steppe-raised, horse-addicted, and used to quick decisions in open plains. Yet here he was, sitting on the soil of the oldest, most bureaucratically complicated civilization in the world. It's like being handed the keys to a Ferrari while only knowing how to ride a unicycle. Learning to rule slowly. Kublai didn't rush. He observed. He learned Mandarin. He studied Confucian classics. He adopted Chinese dress and rituals. He wanted legitimacy. The Mongols ruled China through force, yes, but Kublai wanted it to feel natural. To the locals, he was a foreigner in silk robes trying to pronounce their poetry without spitting on it. To his generals, he was a soft, scholarly prince who'd forgotten the thrill of open plains. Everyone was mildly suspicious. Dadu, the new capital. Kublai moved the capital to Dadu, later Beijing, which he rebuilt in imperial grandeur. The city was designed to awe, confuse, and slightly terrify anyone who entered. He constructed canals, palaces, and markets, borrowing heavily from Chinese architecture, but adding his own Mongol touches. Large, open courtyards, perfect for riding horses indoors, theoretically. Trade flourished. Taxes were collected, not easily, but systematically. Paper money was issued, backed by the Mongol decree. For a while, it worked. It was the steppe meeting the rice fields, and sometimes clumsily.
War again. Kublai loved culture, yes, but he also liked conquest. He launched campaigns into Vietnam, Burma, and Japan. Japan didn't cooperate. Typhoons famously destroyed his fleets. Vietnam and Burma were messy. Supply lines were long, tropical, and full of diseases no Mongol cavalry had ever trained for. After a while, Kublai started wondering if maybe ruling from a palace was more efficient than ruling from a warship, which it probably was. The Great Administrator. What Kublai really excelled at was administration. He divided the empire into provinces, each managed by a governor. He relied on Chinese bureaucrats to keep records. He encouraged trade along the Silk Road, and he tolerated all religions, Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, Christianity, Islam, as long as everyone paid taxes. It's tempting to think of him as a soft ruler compared to his grandfather, but that would be misleading. He could still be ruthless when necessary, executing corrupt officials, confiscating property, and occasionally reminding the Chinese literati that he held the army, which is a very persuasive form of suggestion. The literary side. Kublai was fascinated by stories of the world beyond his borders. This is why Marco Polo was able to stay at court for 20 years. Polos marveled at canals, palaces, and paper currency, which he later exaggerated for dramatic effect. Kublai encouraged chroniclers to document everything: laws, commerce, astronomy, and even farming techniques. In his mind, knowledge was just another form of conquest, less bloody, but equally permanent. The cultural conundrum. Despite his efforts, Kublai never fully became Chinese. The Chinese literati remained skeptical. The Mongol military aristocracy thought him too soft. Meanwhile, steppe traditions persisted. Horse riding, hunting, and military titles continued to define social status. Kublai lived in a delicate tension: Mongol by blood, Chinese by ambition, global by curiosity. And yet somehow he made it work, mostly. It's impressive in the slow, steady, mildly ironic way history prefers. A dynasty that outlasted him. Kublai's Yuan dynasty lasted roughly a century. After his death in 1294, the empire gradually weakened. Factional disputes, corruption, and rebellion slowly chipped away at the authority he had painstakingly built. By 1368, the Ming dynasty finally overthrew the Yuan in China proper, forcing Mongol rulers to retreat north to the steppes. And yet, the roads, the canals, the administrative systems, and the notion of a unified empire across vast distances, that outlived him. His attempt to become Chinese left a blueprint for hybrid rule that influenced later dynasties and governments. The sleepy lesson. Kublai Khan's story isn't about swords or storms. It's about patience, adaptation, and a sort of quiet stubbornness. He inherited chaos and tried to shape it into civilization. Sometimes he succeeded, sometimes he failed, but he kept moving. Not with cavalry charges, but with architecture,
diplomacy, and administrative ingenuity. And in the long run, maybe that's harder and slower than anything Genghis ever did. A gentle reflection. So, tonight, imagine Kublai walking through Dadu at dusk. Lanterns flicker, scholars murmur, horses stomp softly in distant courtyards. He's neither fully Mongol nor fully Chinese, but he doesn't mind. He's learned that power isn't only about fear. It's also about patience, infrastructure, and the occasional paper note that promises value, if people trust it. Because empires, like sleep, are fragile. They need both energy and calm. And for a century or so, Kublai managed both, just barely, quietly, and mostly without waking anyone up.
The Mongols and the West. Trade, diplomacy, and the illusion of peace. Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we travel west, slowly, gently, along the same roads that once carried horses, merchants, and envoys across the Eurasian steppe. We're not chasing armies, we're following diplomacy, trade, and the quiet flow of influence. Because while Europe remembered the Mongols as horsemen of doom, there was a subtler, quieter story unfolding. The Mongols' careful engagement with a world they had never seen. Europe's fearful curiosity. For centuries, Europe's view of the Mongols was dramatic. Reports described hordes sweeping from the east, cities burning, rivers turning red. Legends grew, the scourge of God, the Tartars, a people who could ride from sunrise to sunset without tiring. By the 1250s, European monarchs and the Pope had decided two things. The Mongols were terrifying. Maybe they could be persuaded to not kill everyone. So envoys and missionaries were sent east. Letters crossed deserts, rivers, and mountains. Some were returned unopened. Some were opened, read, and ignored. And a few actually made it to Karakorum, or the Yuan court. The first diplomatic exchanges. One of the famous envoys was John of Plano Carpini, a Franciscan monk sent by Pope Innocent IV in 1245. He traveled thousands of miles, encountering steppe life, deserts, and Mongol hospitality, which could be polite or deadly, depending on your manners. Carpini's observations were meticulous. The Mongols valued loyalty and discipline. Their law, the yasa, was strange, but surprisingly consistent. They were curious about religion, but unpersuaded by European notions of papal authority. His letters home painted the Mongols as civilized in a terrifying, efficient way. Not savages, just, well, immensely organized. Trade routes, silk, spices, and salt. Diplomacy aside, trade became the quiet bridge between East and West. Silk from China reached Venice. Spices from India reached Paris. Salt, furs, and metals moved eastward. The Mongols didn't invent trade, but they protected it. Caravanserai, the Mongol equivalents of motels for traders, popped up along the Silk Road. Merchants could rest, eat, and safely continue, protected by imperial decree. For a time, Europe enjoyed luxuries it had never known. Porcelain, medicinal herbs, exotic fruits. It's easy to forget that these comforts were made possible by the same people Europeans feared most.
The illusion of peace. This period, roughly 1250 to 1350, is sometimes called Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. It was
selective. Violence and terror still existed, but across the main trade routes, Mongol control kept things surprisingly calm. Letters and gifts traveled like rivers of ink. The Pope sent envoys with letters and gifts. European kings sent ambassadors hoping for alliances against common enemies. Mongol Khans replied with carefully worded demands, sometimes polite, sometimes threatening. Europe thought they were building bridges. Mongols mostly thought, sure, entertain yourselves, just don't forget who controls the roads.
The Mongol legacy in Russia, from horde to tsardom. Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight we drift northward, beyond the steppes and deserts to the forests and rivers of Eastern Europe. The Mongols have been slowing down for a while, but their shadow lingers. Specifically, the Golden Horde, which held sway over Russian principalities for centuries. And while it may not sound dramatic, their influence quietly reshaped an entire region. The rise of the Golden Horde. After Genghis Khan's death, his descendants split the empire. One of these divisions became the Golden Horde, stretching from the Volga River to the Black Sea. The horde was ruled by Badu Khan, a grandson of Genghis. He didn't march into Russia to stay forever. Mostly he wanted tribute and obedience, which is convenient because the Russians were busy bickering amongst themselves anyway. Over the next century, the horde maintained control through tribute collection rather than constant conquest. Russian princes paid taxes, sent hostages, and occasionally fought each other, which frankly made administration remarkably easy for the Mongols. A delicate balance. The horde never settled permanently in Russian lands. They had no interest in adopting Slavic customs, building cities, or planting wheat. Instead, they remained nomadic overlords, horses, yurts, and courts that moved as needed. This created a peculiar situation. Russian cities were ruled from afar, mostly by letters and envoys. Local princes retained day-to-day power, but ultimate authority rested with a distant Khan who could, at any moment, summon troops or change leadership. It's like working for a boss who only emails once a year. Terrifying if you forget the email exists. Tribute and taxes. The Mongols were excellent at taxation. They implemented censuses, regulated markets, and assigned local officials to enforce tribute payments. This system allowed the horde to maintain wealth without the constant physical presence of armies. Russian princes, in turn, grew adept at administration, diplomacy, and occasionally bribery. Essentially, the horde outsourced governance, an hands-off empire that still demanded respect. Moscow's slow rise. In the Mongol Age, the Russian principalities were a rather dark place, often subject to raids by the horde or Tartar hunters. In time, Moscow grew up from a small fragment under the protection of the Mongols in the Golden Horde. Moscow excelled at the collection of tribute. This allowed them to set their pace and later rise as the dominant city in Russia. By the late 1400s, Moscow stopped paying tribute. The horde attempted to respond, but its own power was declining. One quiet rebellion led to another, and eventually, the horde's influence faded, not through epic battle, but by slow erosion and administrative decay. Culture under Mongol rule. Despite their fearsome reputation, the Mongols allowed local customs to continue. The Orthodox Church thrived. Russian princes remained largely autonomous, and trade continued along the Volga and Dnieper rivers. In a way, the Golden Horde functioned as a stabilizing force. Their presence prevented constant warfare between rival Russian states and introduced concepts of centralized authority, taxation, and record-keeping. It's ironic, the Mongols, who arrived as conquerors, became inadvertent teachers of governance. Military influence. Russian armies adopted Mongol tactics and organization over time. Cavalry maneuvers,
scouting techniques, and even the concept of mobile warfare came from the horde. By the 15th and 16th centuries, when Russia expanded eastward, these methods were integral to their success. So technically, every time a Russian explorer or soldier rode into Siberia, they were echoing the horde centuries later. The quiet collapse. By the end of the 15th century, the horde was a shadow of its former self. Internal disputes, economic strain, and rising local powers, especially Moscow, slowly chipped away at authority. By the early 16th century, the Golden Horde had fragmented into smaller khanates, Kazan, Astrakhan, and Crimea. Yet, even in decay, the Mongols' influence persisted. Centralized power in Russian politics, administrative practices, military organization. In short, they reshaped the world without ever truly settling it. A sleepy reflection. So tonight, picture the Russian steppe under a pale winter sky. Caravans move slowly along frozen rivers. Princes collect taxes with meticulous care, knowing distant riders could appear at any moment. Church bells ring quietly in wooden towns. The Mongols are not charging across the fields anymore. They're gone, but the patterns they left behind endure. The echo of empire is in governance, in strategy, in the very notion that one city could rise above all others. Moscow would eventually become a Tsardom, and the Golden Horde? It would become a memory, softened by time, but never entirely forgotten. Closing thought. The story of the Golden Horde is not one of dramatic battles or spectacular heroics. It's about influence, slow and quiet. It's about how an empire can reshape the world long after the horses have left the field. And maybe, in the quiet hours, that's the most enduring form of power.
The Mongol influence on the Islamic world, trade, culture, and transformation. Hey friends, welcome back. Tonight, we follow the Mongols into Persia and the greater Islamic world. No sweeping cavalry charges this time. Instead, we'll look at subtle power, cultural shifts, and quiet transformation. Because while conquest brought terror, governance and culture often left a longer, slower mark. The Ilkhanate emerges. After Genghis Khan's death, his grandson Hulagu led a Mongol army into the Middle East. By the 1250s, he had established the Ilkhanate in Persia, a khanate that controlled modern-day Iran, Iraq, and surrounding regions. Hulagu's conquests were brutal initially. Baghdad, the Abbasid capital, was famously sacked in 1258. Libraries burned, scholars fled, and the city's population plummeted. But once the initial violence passed, the Mongols settled into governance. And unlike in Russia, the steppe overlords stayed longer, adapted, and slowly became part of the local political landscape. Adapting to culture. Hulagu and his successors were pragmatic. They recognized that controlling Persia meant respecting its bureaucracy, religion, and economy. Over time, many Mongols converted to Islam, or at least outwardly observed local traditions. This eased tensions and allowed governance to continue smoothly. Interestingly, Mongol rulers encouraged scholarship, art, and architecture. Persian cities flourished under a blend of Mongol efficiency and local cultural richness. So while initial conquest was terrifying, the resulting era was surprisingly productive. Trade and the Silk Road. The Ilkhanate played a central role in connecting East and West. Silk, spices, precious metals, and ideas flowed along the roads the Mongols protected. Merchants, long accustomed to dangerous travel, now enjoyed relative safety. This period also facilitated the transmission of scientific knowledge. Persian astronomers, mathematicians, and engineers communicated with their Chinese counterparts via Mongol channels. Even medical knowledge and agricultural techniques crossed borders, quietly shaping regional development. Art and architecture. Under Mongol influence, Persian art and architecture evolved. Mongol tastes merged with local traditions, producing intricate tile work, grand mausoleums, and sprawling gardens. Illustrated manuscripts flourished. Poets wrote for Mongol patrons, while scholars documented history and science. The fusion of cultures created a lasting aesthetic that would influence the region for centuries. The quiet spread of Islam. While the Mongols initially disrupted Islamic rule, conversion was inevitable. By the late 13th century, the Elkars largely embraced Islam. This allowed integration with the local populace and legitimized their rule. Yet the Mongols retained certain steppe practices, like cavalry organization and administrative oversight. The result was a hybrid society, Persian culture guided by Mongol pragmatism.
Administration and governance. The Ilkhans introduced centralized record-keeping and taxation systems. They maintained loyalty through strategic marriages, appointments of trusted Mongols, and tolerance of local elites. Unlike the chaos of fragmented succession seen elsewhere, the Ilkhanate's administration was surprisingly coherent. This created stability that allowed commerce and culture to thrive. The slow decline. By the mid-14th century, internal disputes and succession crises weakened the Ilkhanate. Famine, plague, and financial strain compounded the decline. By the 1330s, the Khanate fractured into smaller principalities, but the Mongol influence persisted. Cities, trade networks, art, and administration all retained traces of Mongol governance. Even as local dynasties rose, the imprint of the steppe lingered in law, military organization, and bureaucracy. A sleepy reflection. Imagine the deserts and mountains of Persia at twilight. Caravans move slowly along the Silk Road. Scholars record observations under oil lamps. Architects design palaces blending local stone with Mongol motifs. The Mongols are no longer marauding across the landscape. They are patrons, administrators, and cultural intermediaries. And in the quiet of that integration, history unfolds more subtly than any battle could dictate. The empire's shadow here is not of horses or arrows, but of roads, books, and enduring cultural exchange. Closing thought. The story of the Ilkhanate reminds us that conquest can be both destructive and generative. Terror is temporary. Systems, ideas, and culture endure. Mongols shaped Persia not only by fear, but by careful governance, trade, and adoption of local traditions. It's a reminder that history isn't only about dramatic moments. Sometimes it's about quiet bridges, the ones that last even when empires fade.
The Mongol decline in China and Central Asia. Fragments of a once great empire. Hey friends, welcome back. Tonight, we drift back east and center, over deserts and rivers, into the slowly crumbling edges of Mongol power. We're not chasing armies, we're noticing how empires quietly unravel. This is part 13, where the Yuan dynasty and the Chagatai Khanate begin to show cracks, not with dramatic battles, but with slow decay. The Yuan dynasty slows down. After Kublai Khan's death in 1294, the Yuan dynasty in China faced what bureaucrats call structural issues and what historians call slowly smoldering chaos. China was vast, rich, and complicated, and the Mongols were, at heart, steppe people. They tried to govern through Chinese officials, Mongol nobles, and a mix of military oversight. It worked for a while. Then it didn't. Problems accumulated. Corruption. Officials collected taxes, some for themselves. Natural disasters. Floods, droughts, and famine hit the countryside. Rebellions. Small uprisings grew as peasants, artisans, and local leaders grew impatient. All of this was exacerbated by a disconnect between Mongol rulers and Chinese subjects. Cultural gaps, language barriers, and resentment created tension, not explosive, but persistent. Economic strains. The Yuan attempted innovations like paper money and large-scale public works. Some projects succeeded, others failed spectacularly. Inflation eroded trust in currency. The treasury struggled to cover military expenses and imperial extravagance. Meanwhile, local landlords and officials hoarded wealth, undermining the central government. The result? A slow, almost imperceptible decline, like sand slipping through fingers. The Red Turban Rebellion. By the 1350s, peasants and local leaders, fed up with mismanagement, formed what became the Red Turban Rebellion. It wasn't a single decisive battle. It was decades of sporadic uprisings across northern China. Urban centers and countryside alike were affected. Eventually, one of the rebel leaders, Zhu Xuanzhang, consolidated power. By 1368, he established the Ming dynasty, and the Yuan court retreated north into Mongolia. China was still governed, still bustling, just under a new name. The Mongols' direct control had faded, quietly, without the fanfare of Genghis's campaigns, but with the inevitability of a snowdrift slowly melting.
The Chagatai Khanate. Central Asia had its own story. The Chagatai Khanate, covering modern-day Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and parts of Kazakhstan, split early into eastern and western halves. Rivalries and succession disputes prevented centralized authority from lasting. Local tribes, accustomed to autonomy, resisted external control. The Khanate's administrative structure was thin. Authority depended largely on personal loyalty rather than institutional systems. Despite these challenges, the region remained strategically important. Trade routes connecting China, Persia, and India ran through it. Cities like Samarkand and Bukhara flourished culturally, blending Mongol influence with Persian, Turkic, and Islamic traditions. Even in political fragmentation, the legacy of the Mongols persisted in commerce, urban development, and cultural exchange. Fragmentation and local rule. By the late 14th century, the Chagatai Khanate had fractured completely. Smaller states and warlords controlled the region. The western Chagatai territories leaned toward local Turkic dynasties. The eastern Chagatai territories, eventually influenced by Timur or Tamerlane, experienced both devastation and renewal. The Mongols were still nominally in charge, but their authority was mostly symbolic. The empire had become a memory in the hands of local rulers. A slow, uneventful end. Notice the pattern. Unlike Genghis Khan's dramatic expansions, the collapse of these regions was slow. No final battle decided the fate of the Yuan or Chagatai Khanate. Instead, it was a combination of internal weakness, corruption, rebellion, and administrative challenges. Power quietly seeped away. The Mongol influence persisted in law, trade, and culture, but the Khans themselves became minor figures, historical echoes, rather than active rulers. A sleepy reflection. Picture the plains and mountains of Central Asia at sunset. Steppe riders are few. Caravans continue along the Silk Road. Cities hum quietly with merchants, scholars, and artisans. The horses that once carried the world's greatest conquerors have slowed. The Khans are distant, and their authority is a suggestion, more than a command. Empires, it seems, are less like explosions and more like rivers. They swell, they flow, and eventually they trickle into many smaller streams. And even when power fades, the infrastructure, the culture, and the memory remain. Central Asia and northern China retain Mongol traces, not in banners or hooves, but in patterns of governance, trade, and culture. Closing thought. The decline of the Yuan dynasty and the Chagatai Khanate reminds us that history often ends quietly. No one stands on a hill to announce the fall. Instead, layers of mismanagement, rebellion, and shifting loyalties accumulate. The empire doesn't vanish. It fragments, leaving traces for centuries. And in those traces, the story of the Mongols continues to whisper across deserts, rivers, and the slow march of time.
The Mongols and the Black Death. How the plague rode the empire. Hey friends, welcome back. Tonight, we drift into a quieter, darker part of the story. No sweeping cavalry charges this time. Instead, a reminder that empires leave traces in ways even their rulers never intended. We're talking about the plague, the infamous Black Death, and how it spread along the very roads the Mongols maintained. The stage, Pax Mongolica. By the mid-13th century, the Mongol Empire had created Pax Mongolica, a period of relative stability across Eurasia. Trade, communication, and travel flourished. Caravan routes stretched thousands of miles. Merchants, envoys, and soldiers moved with relative safety, a remarkable achievement for an empire known for terrifying anyone in its path. And that very efficiency, that ability to connect distant regions, would have consequences the Khans could not foresee. Enter the plague. The disease we now call Yersinia pestis, or the Black Death, likely originated in Central Asia. It spread quietly among rodents and fleas. Once humans became part of the chain, the disease traveled along trade routes, rivers, and caravan trails. The Mongol Empire, by connecting cities from China to Persia to Eastern Europe, inadvertently provided the perfect highway. Merchants carried goods, coins, and information, and unknowingly carried plague as well. Siege and biological warfare. There's a famous episode during the Mongol siege of Kaffa in modern Crimea in 1346. The Mongols, already affected by plague, allegedly hurled corpses over city walls. Whether true or exaggerated, the story illustrates a grim reality. Disease was now part of the toolkit of empire, intentionally or not. Ships and caravans leaving Kaffa brought the plague to Mediterranean ports. From there, it moved through Europe, spreading city by city, village by village, until it reached the northernmost reaches of the continent. Slow, invisible consequences. The plague didn't announce itself with drums or banners. It traveled quietly, silently, riding the waves of trade and communication. Merchants and travelers often had no idea they were vectors. Empires that relied on mobility and connectivity inadvertently accelerated its spread. Some cities lost half their population. Rural communities were decimated. Entire trade networks stalled or collapsed. It's worth noting the irony. The very infrastructure that made the Mongol Empire so impressive also made Europe vulnerable to one of history's deadliest pandemics. Social and economic shifts. The Black Death shaped society slowly. Labor shortages gave peasants leverage, eventually altering feudal relationships. Cities reorganized, rebuilding markets and guilds. Religious and cultural practices shifted in response to massive mortality. The Mongols themselves suffered, particularly in the Western Khanates. The Golden Horde and Ilkhanate saw population declines, which weakened administrative control and hastened fragmentation. So even distant rulers were affected, not by armies, but by bacteria.
quiet reflection. Imagine the trade routes at night, caravans winding across deserts, rivers reflecting lanterns, horses treading softly. The same routes that carried silk, spices, and messages also carried something invisible. No one could see it coming. No one could stop it. The Mongol Empire that had united so much of the known world under a single authority now became an unwitting vector of catastrophe. And yet, life persisted. Cities rebuilt, trade resumed, societies adapted, slowly, painfully, but persistently. Closing thought. History is rarely just battles and rulers. Sometimes it's about unintended consequences. The Mongols created roads, trade networks, and communication channels that reshaped Eurasia. And in doing so, they also carried disease, change, and disruption in ways no one could predict. So tonight, as you drift off, imagine the quiet movement of people and animals across vast distances. Empires rise and fall, but the invisible traces of their influence, good and bad, linger in ways both subtle and profound.
The Mongols in Europe, raids, diplomacy, and the fear that never left.
Hey friends, welcome back.
Tonight we drift into the westernmost reaches of the Mongol Empire. No massive battles this time, mostly slow marches, strategic raids, and the psychological impact of the steppe reaching Europe. It's a story of both action and quiet tension, the kind that unfolds over months rather than hours. The first encounters. By the 1230s and 1240s, Mongol forces under generals like Subutai and Batu Khan had begun probing into Eastern Europe. Hungary, Poland, and parts of modern Romania felt the first tremors of the steppe. Cities weren't always destroyed, but the reports were terrifying. Horsemen arriving faster than expected, arrows raining from all directions, entire towns abandoning walls to flee or negotiate. Europeans, unfamiliar with the speed and discipline of Mongol warfare, were unnerved. The tales that reached courts and monasteries were half legend, half accurate, and entirely frightening. Raids and strategy. Unlike in Asia, the Mongols didn't always intend to permanently occupy Europe. They were more interested in reconnaissance, tribute, and strategic influence. Reconnaissance. Scouts mapped terrain, assessed armies, and noted fortifications. Tribute. Some towns paid off the Mongols rather than face destruction. Psychological warfare. Panic spread faster than armies. News of Mongol ruthlessness often prompted towns to surrender without a fight. These raids were precise, disciplined, and methodical, not chaotic looting sprees. Europeans often misinterpreted this as random barbarism, which only amplified fear.
Diplomacy across the steppe. The Mongols also sent envoys into Europe, sometimes to demand submission, sometimes to gauge alliances. For example, envoys from the Great Khan carried letters to kings and the Pope, urging acknowledgement of Mongol authority. Europeans were unsure how to respond. Some sent gifts, others sent missionaries. The Mongols were polite in their way and sometimes even offered alliances against mutual enemies, like the Muslims in the Middle East. It's important to note, diplomacy was as much a tool of control as warfare. Fear opened doors, and negotiation solidified influence. Cultural impact. Though Mongol forces didn't permanently settle in most of Europe, their presence left subtle marks. Military tactics, some cavalry strategies and reconnaissance methods were studied and adopted. Cartography. Reports of Mongol movements and territories improved European maps, though often exaggerated.
psychology of fear. The idea that distant steppe riders could appear anywhere influenced European military planning for decades. Even when the Mongols left, the memory of their efficiency and unpredictability lingered. The withdrawal. By the mid-1240s, Mongol forces withdrew from much of Central Europe. Several factors influenced this. The death of the great Khan Urjadeh could require generals to return to Mongolia. Maintaining distant supply lines was impractical. Political calculations suggested that intimidation and limited tribute were sufficient for influence. So the Mongols didn't vanish because of defeat. They left strategically, leaving behind a continent profoundly aware of their presence. The sleepy reflection. Picture Eastern Europe in the aftermath, villages rebuilding, towns reinforcing walls, local lords nervously tallying troops. The horizon is empty, but the memory of horsemen lingers. Europe had faced an empire built on fear, speed, and discipline. No banners remained in the fields, but the echo of arrows and disciplined chaos persisted in stories, maps, and treaties. And that echo shaped European thinking for decades. Preparation, intelligence gathering, and strategic alliances became more important than sheer numbers. Lessons quietly learned from a distant empire that appeared and vanished like a ghost. Closing thought. The Mongol presence in Europe was brief but unforgettable. They didn't conquer everything. That was never the goal. They left behind fear, improved knowledge, and a subtle restructuring of strategic thinking. Sometimes influence is quieter than conquest. Sometimes it rides on memory rather than horses. And tonight, as you imagine open fields in Hungary or Poland, think of the silent steppe riders who passed through once, leaving Europe forever aware of the vastness and discipline of the Mongol world.
The legacy of Mongol rule in the Middle East. Trade, culture, and power after Genghis. Hey friends, welcome back. Tonight, we drift southward again into Persia, Mesopotamia, and the wider Middle East. The Mongols have already arrived, conquered, and caused terror. Now we're exploring the quieter, slower impact they had on trade, culture, and governance. Because empires aren't only about battles. Sometimes they leave their mark in markets, cities, and administration. The Ilkhanate consolidates. After Genghis, his grandson Hulagu established the Ilkhanate in Persia. He brought armies, administrators, and a surprisingly practical approach to rule. Baghdad had been sacked in 1258, ending the Abbasid Caliphate's direct political power. Temples, libraries, and institutions were destroyed, yes, but Hulagu recognized that lasting rule required more than terror. Local administrators were retained. Tax systems were standardized. Trade routes were monitored and protected. The Mongols weren't just conquerors, they were pragmatic governors. Trade and economic influence. The Ilkhanate revitalized trade across the region. Caravans traveled safely along previously dangerous routes. Goods from China, India, and Europe flowed through Persian markets. Cities like Tabriz, Baghdad, and Isfahan thrived as hubs of commerce. Merchants, both local and foreign, benefited from stability enforced by Mongol authority. Europeans and Asians could now communicate and trade over thousands of miles with fewer risks. Even the plague, which would arrive decades later, traveled along these same routes, an unintended consequence of Mongol efficiency.
Cultural synthesis. The Ilkhanate was a meeting point of cultures. Mongol traditions mixed with Persian art and architecture. Chinese influence appeared in administration, printing, and palace design. Islamic scholarship continued, sometimes under Mongol patronage. This fusion produced a unique cultural flowering. Art, literature, and science thrived in a court that was simultaneously foreign and deeply connected to local traditions. It's a gentle irony. Conquerors who destroyed can also create. Administration and bureaucracy. Mongols implemented a system that allowed them to rule vast territories with minimal direct presence. Provincial governors maintained local order. Tribute collection was systematic, not arbitrary. Postal systems and couriers ensured communication across deserts and mountains. This administration was lean, efficient, and surprisingly effective. Even as later Mongol rulers weakened, the systems they left behind endured. Religious policy. Mongol rulers were pragmatic about religion. Initially, they tolerated multiple faiths. Over time, many ilkhans converted to Islam, integrating with local society. Religious leaders often advised the court, ensuring loyalty from the populace. This policy reduced resistance and allowed Mongols to become accepted, if not entirely beloved, rulers. The subtle influence. Unlike the initial conquest, which brought terror, this period was marked by quieter influence. Trade routes and urban centers flourished. Administrative practices persisted. Military organization and governance techniques inspired future local rulers. Even as the Mongol Empire in the Middle East fragmented, its cultural, economic, and administrative legacies endured. A sleepy reflection. Picture the Middle Eastern plains under the soft glow of sunset. Merchants pack caravans in Tabriz. Scholars discuss mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy in Persian cities. Bridges and roads maintained by Mongol administrators quietly facilitate commerce. The terror of conquest has faded. The empire's shadow lingers in the form of organization, culture, and economic vitality. And in the quiet of this stability, life continues, slowly, persistently, and with a subtle Mongol rhythm that outlasted their direct rule. Closing thought. The Mongol legacy in the Middle East is a reminder that empires leave more than monuments and stories of war. They leave systems, connections, and cultural blending that persist long after the Khans have gone. Tonight, imagine caravans moving quietly across deserts, scholars writing in lamplit rooms, and the hum of cities rebuilt from ashes. Empires, even brutal ones, can shape the world in ways that are surprisingly gentle over time.
The Mongols in Russia revisited, from horde to tsardom. Hey friends, welcome back. Tonight, we drift gently northward again, to the forests, rivers, and plains of Russia. We're not chasing battles or bloodshed this time. Instead, we'll explore how the Mongols quietly reshaped Russian politics, society, and the eventual rise of Moscow. It's a story of influence, patience, and the kind of slow power that accumulates over decades. The Golden Horde's dominion. After Genghis's death, the Mongol Empire fragmented. One of its westernmost branches became the Golden Horde, stretching from the Volga River to the Black Sea. Unlike the dramatic conquests of Central Asia, the Horde's approach in Russia was methodical. Cities and towns paid tribute. Local princes retained daily authority. Mongol oversight was enforced through envoys, taxes, and occasional military presence. It was indirect control,
not constant occupation. Russia, in a sense, governed itself under Mongol supervision. Tribute and administration. The horde demanded regular tribute, money, goods, and hostages from the ruling elite. This created a strange dynamic. Russian princes gained wealth and authority by efficiently collecting taxes. The Mongols ensured compliance without micromanaging daily life. Local governance structures grew more sophisticated as princes learned to administer both their people and the horde's demands. Moscow, in particular, excelled at this. Its princes acted as tax collectors for the Mongols while quietly consolidating power. Over time, this made Moscow richer, more influential, and politically indispensable. Cultural and military influence. Even as the Mongols remained foreign rulers, their influence seeped into Russian society. Military organization borrowed steppe tactics, cavalry mobility, reconnaissance, and strategic retreat. Administrative practices, censuses, record-keeping, and taxation systems became standard. The Orthodox Church continued to function, often as a stabilizing force between local rulers and the horde. It's ironic, conquerors who terrorized Europe also inadvertently taught governance and military strategy to their subjects. Moscow's gradual rise. By the 14th century, Moscow's clever diplomacy and strategic position allowed it to emerge as the dominant Russian principality. It became the principal collector of Mongol tribute. Rival princes were outmaneuvered, bribed, or co-opted. Wealth and population grew, providing the resources to expand influence. Eventually, Moscow stopped paying tribute altogether. The horde, weakened by internal disputes and declining control, could not respond effectively. And thus, a new power, the future Tsardom of Russia, quietly emerged from beneath the Mongol shadow. Fragmentation of the horde. By the late 15th century, the Golden Horde was fragmenting into smaller khanates, Kazan, Astrakhan, Crimea. Mongol control was increasingly symbolic. Local rulers held real power, and the horde's administrative system slowly dissolved. Yet even in decline, the Mongols' imprint endured. Centralized administration in Russia owed much to steppe practices. Military tactics continued to influence Russian forces. Trade along rivers and roads maintained networks established under Mongol supervision. The empire faded, but the patterns it left behind persisted. A sleepy reflection. Imagine the Russian steppe under a pale winter sky. Rivers freeze, caravans carry tribute slowly toward distant khans. Princes calculate taxes, prepare reports, and negotiate loyalties. Church bells ring quietly in wooden towns. The Mongols are no longer charging across the fields. Their horses have gone, but the rhythm of governance, the lessons in diplomacy, and the echoes of their control remain, subtle but persistent. Closing thought. The story of the Golden Horde shows us that empires influence the world in ways far beyond conquest. It's about networks, systems, and the slow accumulation of authority. And in Russia, those lessons paved the way for the rise of Moscow and the eventual Tsardom. Tonight, as you imagine frozen rivers and snow-covered plains, consider how influence can outlast horses, banners, and even entire empires. Sometimes, the quiet legacy is the most enduring.
The Mongols in Central Asia and the Silk Road. Commerce, culture, and continuity. Hey friends, welcome back.
Tonight, we drift across the deserts, mountains, and rivers of Central Asia, following the subtle but enduring influence of the Mongols. No dramatic battles here, just trade, culture, and the quiet workings of an empire that reshaped Eurasia in ways that lasted centuries. The heart of the steppe. Central Asia, the vast land of deserts, rivers, and oases, was the core of Mongol heritage. Even as the empire fragmented, the region remained strategically important. Cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Khiva continued to thrive as trade hubs. Nomadic groups maintained mobility, herding, and local governance. The Mongols' administrative and military systems lingered in local practice. The steppe, harsh and unchanging, allowed traditions to persist, and the Mongols, even in decline, left a framework for governance, trade, and diplomacy. Trade along the Silk Road. One of the most lasting legacies of the Mongols was their role in Silk Road commerce. Caravans traveled safely across previously dangerous territories. Merchants carried silk, spices, metalwork, and ideas from China to Persia and beyond. Banking, credit, and safe passage were increasingly standardized. European merchants and travelers, like Marco Polo, benefited from these networks, documenting the region and spreading knowledge back west. The Mongols had transformed the Silk Road into a highway of ideas, goods, and culture.
Cultural exchange. Central Asia became a meeting point of multiple traditions. Persian, Turkic, Chinese, and Mongol influences blended in art, architecture, and scholarship. Cities grew as centers of learning, with madrasas, observatories, and libraries. Language, customs, and governance borrowed from multiple traditions, creating a rich hybrid culture. Even as political authority waned, the empire's cultural and economic frameworks remained intact, demonstrating how empire can outlive conquest. Administration and local governance. The Mongols' administrative innovations endured in Central Asia. Tax collection was structured and predictable. Postal relay systems allowed rapid communication over vast distances. Local rulers retained autonomy, but were integrated into broader networks of authority. These practices persisted in successor states, influencing later empires and khanates long after Mongol authority faded. The quiet decline. By the 15th century, the Chagatai Khanate and other Central Asian territories fragmented. Eastern Chagatai regions became influenced by Timur, or Tamerlane. Western territories fell under local Turkic dynasties. The Mongols themselves became symbolic rulers rather than active administrators. Yet trade continued. Cities prospered. Knowledge was transmitted. In many ways, the empire's quiet infrastructure outlasted its rulers. A sleepy reflection. Picture the deserts and mountains at twilight. Caravans wind slowly along ancient routes. Scholars write under oil lamps. Markets bustle gently in cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, blending fabrics, spices, and ideas from across continents. The Mongols are gone as conquerors. Their armies have faded into memory, but their influence, commerce, culture, and administrative systems, hums quietly across the steppe. Closing thought. Central Asia shows us that empires are more than armies. They are networks of trade, culture, and governance that can persist long after banners have fallen. The Mongols, even in decline, maintained a subtle rhythm that shaped Eurasia for centuries. Tonight, as you drift off, imagine caravans moving silently under the stars, ideas crossing deserts faster than armies ever could, and the quiet legacy of an empire that stretched from China to Europe.
The Mongols and East Asia, the Yuan dynasty, culture, and the return to the steppe. Hey friends, welcome back. Tonight we drift eastward, across mountains, rivers, and the sprawling plains of northern China. We're looking at the Yuan dynasty, the Mongols' most enduring experiment in governing a settled, populous civilization. It's a story of administration, culture, and quiet decline, a far cry from Genghis Khan's thunderous conquests. Kublai Khan's vision. By the late 13th century, Kublai Khan had declared himself Emperor of China, establishing the Yuan dynasty in 1271. He sought to unify China under Mongol rule, bridging the gap between steppe traditions and the vast, settled society of the Middle Kingdom. Administrative systems borrowed from both Mongol and Chinese practices. The civil service was reorganized, with some merit-based appointments. Roads, canals, and infrastructure projects connected the empire efficiently. It was impressive in scale, but also precarious. Governing tens of millions of people required constant attention, communication, and oversight. Cultural integration. Kublai's court embraced both Mongol and Chinese traditions. Art, architecture, and theater blended steppe motifs with Chinese aesthetics. Scholars, engineers, and artisans were patronized to improve administration and culture. Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucian philosophy continued to influence governance. Yet Mongols remained a ruling minority. Cultural differences sometimes caused friction, particularly with the scholar official class and the general population. Economic and administrative challenges. Despite Kublai's best efforts, challenges mounted. Large-scale public works strained resources and labor. Paper currency and fiscal mismanagement caused inflation and resentment. Natural disasters, famine, and epidemic diseases tested the empire's resilience. These issues weren't sudden catastrophes, they were persistent, grinding problems that slowly eroded confidence in Yuan rule. Rebellion and decline. By the mid-14th century, peasant uprisings and local revolts grew in intensity. The Red Turban Rebellion, 1350s, spread across northern China. Local leaders capitalized on Yuan weakness to assert control. Cities fortified themselves and resisted Mongol garrisons. Kublai's successors struggled to maintain authority. By 1368, rebel forces under Zhu Xuanzang captured the Yuan capital, marking the beginning of the Ming dynasty. The Mongols retreated north, returning to their original homelands on the steppe. A return to the steppe. After centuries of ruling vast settled territories, the Mongols found themselves back on the steppe. Their political power in China had collapsed, but steppe traditions endured. They maintained influence in Inner Asia, Mongolia, and neighboring regions. Cultural memory of the Yuan dynasty persisted in Chinese architecture, administration, and trade practices. It's a gentle irony. The Mongols, who had conquered the world's largest population, eventually returned to a life more similar to their ancestors, mobile, pastoral, and dependent on horses. A sleepy reflection. Imagine the northern plains at dusk, wind sweeping across grasslands, yurts dotting the horizon. The cities of China bustle far to the south, their walls and canals reminders of Mongol administration and cultural blending. The steppe is quiet now, except for horses and the occasional caravan. The empire in China has ended,
but its influence lingers in infrastructure, culture, and the memory of rulers who attempted to merge steppe and sedentary life. And the Mongols themselves, returning to familiar pastures, continue their slow, rhythmic life, shaped by centuries of conquest and administration. A closing thought. The story of the Yuan dynasty shows the limits of empire. Even the greatest conquerors struggled to maintain control over vast, settled populations. Yet the legacy is subtle. Administrative innovations, cultural blending, and trade networks outlast the rulers. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, picture the plains of Mongolia stretching endlessly, the distant cities of China humming quietly, and the gentle rhythm of history, a reminder that empires rise, adapt, and eventually fade, leaving traces that whisper through time.
The enduring legacy of the Mongol Empire, memory, influence, and echoes across Eurasia. Hey friends, welcome back. Tonight we drift gently across the vast lands once unified under the Mongols. We're not chasing battles or rulers now, just the quiet, subtle impact of an empire that stretched from the Pacific to Europe and how its memory shaped the world long after the Khans themselves had faded. The Empire in Memory. By the late 14th and 15th centuries, the Mongol Empire had fragmented. The Golden Horde in Eastern Europe was breaking into smaller khanates. The Ilkhanate in Persia was replaced by local dynasties and Timurids. Tregate Khanate in Central Asia split into Eastern and Western realms. The Yuan dynasty retreated to the Mongolian steppe, replaced in China by the Ming. Yet even in absence, the Mongols' influence persisted. Roads, postal systems, and administrative practices remained. Trade networks facilitated the movement of goods, people, and ideas. Cultural exchanges, Persian, Chinese, Turkic, and Mongol, created hybrid traditions still remembered centuries later. It's remarkable. Empires vanish politically, but traces linger quietly. Commerce and the Silk Road. One of the most enduring legacies was trade. The Mongols protected the Silk Road, creating a relatively safe corridor across Eurasia. Goods, ideas, and technologies traveled farther and faster than before. Even Europe, previously isolated from much of Asia, became connected through these networks. Merchants, travelers, and scholars benefited, and the ripple effects of commerce persisted long after Mongol authority waned. Governance and administration. Mongol administrative practices influenced successor states. Centralized tax collection in Russia, Persia, and China borrowed Mongol methods. Military organization and communication systems became models for future armies. Local rulers learned lessons in diplomacy, tribute management, and indirect rule. The Mongols taught that power could be exerted efficiently without constant physical presence, a lesson that rulers across Eurasia would not forget.
Cultural synthesis. Across their empire, the Mongols facilitated encounters between civilizations. Persian art, Chinese architecture, and steppe traditions blended in cities like Samarkand and Khanbalik. Religious tolerance in some regions allowed Islam, Buddhism, Christianity, and shamanistic traditions to coexist. Knowledge, from astronomy to medicine, spread across vast distances. The empire's cultural imprint, though subtle, endured far longer than its political authority. Psychological influence. Even centuries later, the fear of Mongols lingered in collective memory. Europe remembered rapid, disciplined cavalry and the destruction of cities. Russia recalled tribute systems and steppe tactics. Asia remembered both devastation and the administrative and cultural innovations the Mongols introduced.
History shows that influence is not only measured in conquest, but in the subtle reshaping of society's expectations, governance, and strategies. A sleepy reflection. Imagine the vast Eurasian plains at twilight. Caravans move slowly along ancient routes. Rivers, cities, and mountains hum with life shaped indirectly by the Mongols' networks. The steppe is quiet, but the rhythms of administration, trade, and culture echo across continents. The Mongols themselves are gone as conquerors. Their horses, banners, and armies have faded into memory, yet their influence lingers, subtle, pervasive, and enduring, like wind moving across a vast plain, invisible but felt everywhere. Closing thought. The Mongol Empire reminds us that history is not only battles, rulers, and borders. It's networks, commerce, culture, and ideas, the invisible threads that shape civilizations long after armies have left the field. The Khans may be gone, but their empire whispers in cities, roads, and traditions across Eurasia. So tonight, as you drift off, picture the endless steppe, the quiet hum of trade, and the gentle echo of an empire that reshaped the world without ever needing to roar again.